Hello and welcome to my series Authors Talking Shop, where I am in conversation with the great genre writers working today. For this iteration, I am joined by Nick Cutter, aka Craig Davidson, to discuss, among other topics, his latest horror book, The Queen. These conversations are made possible in part thanks to your continued support, so please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is much appreciated. And now, Nick Cutter. Good afternoon, Craig Davidson. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for joining me here to talk about your new book and some of your older works as well.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
But it was beautiful the way they incorporated wasps into the pages. I thought
They
they
did
did
a
a
really
great.
good job.
Yes.
The gang at Simon and Schuster always come up with something interesting on sort of the typographical typesetting level, and yeah, this one was no different. I think it's a nice looking book.
Yes, I agree. Now I have a one line review or one line blurb of your book. Not really about what the book is about, but more about the experience I had with
Yes,
it. So I want to get your reaction on this.
sure.
Okay, and we can edit this if you don't like it.
No, that's fine.
All right. Okay. Carrie meets the Fly, and they go to a trailer park to drop acid.
I think that is probably homing in on two of my biggest influences, King, Carrie specifically, strangely. I shouldn't say strangely, it's a great book, but I sort of pinged on it in my first Cutter book, The Troop, and definitely has resonance here too. And Cronenberg, as a Canadian and a horror lover, whether it's Brandon or obviously his father David, you couldn't have your chevrons as a horror person in Canada without liking those two.
I grew up with David Cronenberg. He's responsible for making me a horror fan. Him and he and Clive Barker, I would think,
And
those two
yeah, I
is.
was gonna say those two. And I would add for me anyways. Carpenter, John Carpenter, sort of falls
Okay.
in there. Sort of the body horror. Obviously, everyone does it a little differently, but yeah, Clive Barker and Cronenberg. I wonder. I've almost felt like for a second one of them was in the other one's movie. I feel like one was. I feel like Cronenberg played a villain in one of Clive Nightbreed.
In
I'm
Nightbreed,
pretty sure
exactly.
he
Cabal,
even got there,
exactly.
didn't he? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. All right. Well, it makes no surprise to me.
Now, I've never heard this expression before. You can't have your chevron?
Oh, sorry, like like a military insignia. It's like a chevron on your shoulder on
I
your
didn't.
it's sort of like a medal, a medallion, sort of
Okay.
a proof of rank. So yeah. It's a very old-timey saying. I'm not surprised it's my buddies say I talk like I'm been frozen from the 1930s. So
Okay. Well, I appreciate the new word. I did not know what a chevron is. Okay. Well, good. It's a learning experience already. Now, I want to jump in with the Queen.
sure.
I had I had read three Nick Cutter books prior to reading The Queen, and they did not prepare me for The
Oh
Queen.
no.
No, they're so wild. I mean, all the Nick Cutter books, the ones I've read, have been wildly different, one from the other, and The Queen is no exception. But how is a reader supposed to prepare themselves for this experience? How would you like them to prepare themselves?
Well, that's a good question. Uh, I suppose some prior, familiarity with the Nick Cutter sort of books will, put certain people in a certain sense of like, okay, we sort of know, I would say, Michael, that, being a writer, there's no better way to sort of, find your obsessions, because you tend to go back to them again and again, whether you want to or not. Sometimes it's the best indicator and bellwether and way to tell you the things that clearly fascinate you on a almost on a subconscious or deeply unconscious level almost. So, um, I mean, to me, the book, what I enjoyed about it was writing, sort of going back into my own childhood, I guess. I mean, obviously, it's written from the perspective of a girl. But, The Troop dealt with my first Nick Cutter book, dealt with sort of boys in their on the cusp of adolescence, probably, 12 or 13. this deals with characters sort of 17, 18 on the cusp of leaving home essentially, potentially, and sort of broaching the wider world and leaving the comforts of their home. And I just think both of those are either the cusp of adolescence or the cusp of sort of adulthood are really interesting liminal times in people's lives. And I think probably for me more than any of the pyrotechnics, which I think, the gory set pieces and things like that, which I enjoy writing. I
Yeah.
give me a great deal of fun and pleasure and giggles to write a lot of that stuff. Um, I usually want to try and anchor it to something that feels resonant to me personally, and more that's, I think, going back into my own past. There's a certain, I don't know about you, I think we're both men, people of a certain age, right? There's a certain innocence, a certain sort of purity that you feel like the world maybe made a little bit more sense when you were at that age, even if it didn't really. But a lot of the pressures of adulthood were waiting, but we were saved from them until we inherit them as grown-ups.
And I was sure that I would conquer them all. I was invincible as a child. And as an adult,
Yeah,
I
me
was going to
too.
rule the world.
That's the folly of youth, right? We
Mhm.
all think we're gonna not make the mistakes that our parents made, and then or grandparents made, and then you find that I mean, such is life. I have a couple children, and they're obviously gonna reach that point where they think that everything that me and my wife, their mom, has done is made a giant hash of the world, and I don't know what I'm gonna be able to say to sort of make them disbelieve that. I probably
You
just say,
won't.
well, wait until you're my age, kiddos, and then
Because it
you
turns out being an adult is more difficult than I thought it would be when I was a
exactly,
child.
yeah, and you're probably gonna, saying to your kids, that's probably gonna be your path too. But who knows? Maybe you'll be the generation to buck the trend. I hope so.
Wow. Well, you mentioned personal, and the Queen is set in your hometown, is it not?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's the first
Okay.
book of. I mean, a lot of the Cutter books are set in Canada. I think I've made an attempt. Well, just made a point really of setting them in my hometown. And I remember, sorry, not my hometown, but my home country. And I remember with the troop. Um, there was talk editorially of could we set this maybe off the coast of Maine or Cape Cod, or there's islands all over the place, Craig. Why don't you pick an island off the coast of mainland America? And I was like, well, no, why?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd rather not, frankly. And it did, obviously didn't make a difference. But I've never set a Cutter book specifically in my own hometown. So I think that was a way, Michael, really to again do my best to anchor myself in that period of my own life and write as well as I could. I mean, that was one of the difficulties of this book is that I'm 49 years old. I was writing this book in my mid to late 40s. I mean, I was in my, it was 1990 when I would have been 1994, sorry, when I would
Mhm.
have been the same age as this character. I mean, you're looking back through a lens of 3 decades, a great accumulation of time and experience that has separated me from that character. And so you're really doing, at least in on my case, I was doing my best to try and find myself, situate myself somehow in that mindset as best as I could. And, going back to my old high school, driving those streets that I, would have biked or, whatever back in the day, or ridden the school bus, had a beneficial effect of sort of putting me back, um, as well as it could do in that mindset from that time.
But the mindset, this is your protagonist, the perspective is from she's 16-year-old girl, right?
She's 18 actually. Yeah,
18,
she's
okay.
so she's right on the cusp of graduating. But yeah, she's young. She's a teenage girl. And that was definitely I mean, every book has its landmines, I guess I'd call them. Some start right away. You get an idea and you're like, well, that's going to be a difficult thing maybe for me to handle, or that is a little bit outside of my bailiwick as a writer, and that's not what I normally do. And some you dismiss for that reason. You just say, well, I mean, every book can be a struggle, so why make it any harder for yourself, right? And then there's other ones that sort of you write your way into. I've always said like if you give your a character an absurd accent on the first page, and
Yeah.
then you find, oh God, I have to continue writing with this bizarre accent for the rest of the book. That's usually when you go back and you just change the accent you just give them a normal voice, right? These are the things you learn through experience. But sometimes you can have a problem that'll just crop up in the middle of the book, and you've got to do your best to sort of like do battlefield surgery and just try and get through it, right? But yeah, I think writing from the perspective of a teenager was not, I've done that before, but it's always
Right.
been teenage boys.
Right.
And so what I tried, and I did really think about whether I could do this from a boy instead. I tried to sort of give myself that out, but the story
Okay.
just wasn't going to tell
Yeah,
itself if I was telling it from the perspective of a boy.
I agree. Yeah.
So, um, so I tried to keep things as universal as I could. Do you know what I mean? Like I think there are some experiences uh that are close to universal human experiences. Obviously something like first love is going to feel different probably from a boy to a girl. To depending what your sexual orientation is would make a difference as well. So but ideally, hopefully the longing and the sort of feelings generated by that experience are there some sort of universality to it. So I think in the book I tried to stick with, or the idea of I said of like of leaving home. Somebody leaves, goes off to university, starts a new life. There's someone else who is left behind. And these two people who feel like they were going to be friends for their entire life suddenly come to a point of estrangement where they just feel themselves slipping away from one another. And there's a great grief, I think, at the gulf that can often bridge two people in that way. And again, that feels universal. Yeah, would it feel different for two girls than it would feel for two boys? Surely at some level. But is there certain things that just feel universally human? I think there are. I'm hoping there are. So those are sort of the emotions, the emotional through lines I think that I chose to focus on.
Now you mentioned two things that reminded me of something. You talk about friendship because the Queen, we hit on lots of different themes, whether it's celebrity culture or obsession. But if you boil it down to it, if you boil it down, it could come down to a story about friendship, right?
That's to me what it was, that to I mean to everyone will take away what they'll take away from it just as any book, but to me from the writer's perspective, the most important thing to investigate and to look at was that yeah, is that scary place really where your roads diverge from somebody who you've been friends with for your entire life, and you truly thought that you were soul mates in a way. You weren't lovers or anything, but you have that closeness of friendship that at a certain point in your life it's impossible for you to think that you're not going to be in that other person's life until you're old and gray. And I felt that way. You must have had friends that way. I think that
Sure.
we all have had that. And then you run into them on the street 5 years later, and you're shocked at just the estrangement that might have set in. And it's nobody's fault. And sometimes there's recrimination or anger, but I think in general it doesn't come from a place of evil on anybody's part. It just comes from a part that when you were made that friendship, you weren't fully formed people yet. And there was a great deal of experience and life to be lived, they might not be in the same contact and closeness that you always thought was going to be the case, right? So I had that experience, it was so painful in a lot of ways, and but also it feels sort of something that so many of us go through. Either you're the one who goes away or you're the one who stays. And I've had it both ways. I've had people who have gone off on adventures, and I've been the one sort of, or at least that's the way it feels, right? And you're the one who's been stuck behind, or the opposite. You're the one who goes away, and they're the ones who are, making a life in the town that you grew up in, sort of a thing. And as we know now as adults, there's no way of saying one is the way to go. There's no route to happiness,
I haven't found it.
assuredly, anyways. So like, but at that age I think some person feels that they're going off to become the person that they always thought they were going to be, and the other person is left behind to suffer in want,
But what
and that's
what
the perspective of that age.
but what you're describing also makes me think of probably my favorite book of yours, which would be Cataract City. And
Yeah,
I'm
very much so.
they
Yeah, Duncan and
I
Owen. I'm,
I
I have a there's a fondness in my heart for that book as well.
okay, good.
Also set in St. Catharines and Niagara Falls, and exactly the same. I get, as I said earlier in this conversation, there's nothing like writing to show you your obsessions and the things that clearly motivate you and the places where you put emotional value. Because you're right, their friendship is quite similar in a lot of ways at it on its baseline
Right.
to Margaret and Charity in this book.
And also I did get a lot of Cataract. Cataract City is not, for the viewers, not a horror book, but I did see similarities also with something I find in a lot of your writing is your characters seem to have a love-hate relationship with the environment that they're in. I noticed that with Cataract City, definitely. Also, Rust and Bone. They're, they have a love for their town, but at the same time, they would love to just not be there. And
Yeah,
I,
I
and I
mean,
got that in the
and I
Queen.
don't know if that resonates. I don't know your background, Michael, but like, I don't know if that, like, I love St. Catharines, if that's the case. You know what I mean? My parents still live there. My brother still lives there. We'll go back there this weekend. You
Okay,
know, um, a lot of my friends still live there, and yet it could have. I think for me, it could have been anywhere. I think I probably write in one of those books at some point. Um, the world is a giant place, and at some point you come to think that like there's great things happening, but they're not happening here.
right.
That's a certain youthful folly, I think, generally, because then to whatever degree you go out and you discover the world that exists out there. And I'm not saying I've been a globetrotter or anything. I haven't, but I've certainly lived different places. And you come back to realizing just how much the place that you came from built you, and how much it is you, and how much you actually miss and love it when you're not there. And yet it's almost like the relationship sometimes with people's parents. You know what I mean? You grow up under their roof, and then you strain against that relationship, and then as soon as you're away from them, you realize, I mean, if you've had good parents, as I was fortunate enough to have, like, oh wow, like they were so great to me, and they were so fundamental to who I am. And I'm so thankful for that. And I think probably for me, now is coming up on my 50th year. That's certainly the way I feel about my hometown. But some of those earlier books, you're right, written, Rust and Bone was written, when I was in my 20s, Cataract City, um, in my 30s. I was probably still working through those kind of emotions of thinking like life is best lived elsewhere, only to ultimately discover that I'm happy where I came from, and life is great there.
But the kids are, yeah, the kids and the Queen have that kind of mentality as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially
Yeah,
one does. Yeah. Oh, you're right, they
yeah,
both do. And I guess from coming from where they come from, um, I did think that's just a quality of youth. I think it is just a simple quality of youth to want to look beyond your place in the world and realize that you're a dot on the map, and the map is massive. And until you get to have some experience outside of that and realize that maybe it's the same all around. But I don't know. There's some people I know in my hometown who left and never want to come back. And I'll run into them later, and they're like, "You'll never catch me within that town again." And it's not that. I mean, that would be any place, right? Like there's
right. Of
people in
course,
my
sure.
hometown, well, right here in Toronto, who they leave the city and they're a vapor trail, So just like it just doesn't harmonize with them for whatever reason.
But that's a quality in your writing that I really took to how your characters, how they view their environments, because I never really had like a hometown. I just
Oh
moved
no?
around. No, I just moved around my whole life, like in between France and the United States, and now I'm in Eastern Europe, and I don't have like any. So when your characters, when they have this love-hate relationship with their environments and their cities, it allows me to live vicariously because I don't have any experiences like that. I don't have a home country or home city to
Is
feel
so
strong
that's your
about.
own, I mean, that to me, that's its own fascinating
Yeah,
outlook and perspective. And I don't know if you've written about that or have any interest in writing about that, but like
yeah,
that kind.
yeah.
Oh, that these are all, yeah, okay. These are,
I'm
why
doing.
see, what's that? Sorry.
Oh yeah, this is my
Oh, okay, I was gonna say because
travel
I saw
log
like a
fiction.
Barbara Kingsolver there. So
Oh yeah,
okay.
she's not mine. Yeah, the
Okay.
restaurant, the restaurant. Some of these are mine. Some of them.
Okay, okay, got it. Okay.
But yeah, this is my
Um,
journey
and
through
is
Europe.
that a quality of your writing as well? Like, do you the idea that you are um peripatetically sort of you just sort of you don't have a roots in a certain way.
There's definitely that in this, the orthography of madness and misgiving. This is definitely traveling around Europe and looking for a home. Yeah, definitely that.
And have you found that you've not found one? Is that what the conclusion you sort of come to,
I'm,
or
I'm still looking. I'm still looking. Yeah. I tell you, if I had papers, I would move to Canada in a second.
would you?
Yeah. I spent one winter in Vancouver and I just thought it was amazing.
Oh yeah,
So,
I mean yeah, and you probably barely felt the winter in Vancouver because it's that coastal city. It tends as for not that I've spent a lot of time there, but I feel like they don't have winter like the rest of Canada does. So well, I mean, Michael, life is still long, the search can continue. You might finally find a place where you feel like you've got some, hand in glove kind of feeling to your surroundings.
I hope so. Latvia is not it, though. I've been here three
No,
months, and that's not the
you've been there
solution.
long enough to make that decision.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. But I'm going to give it time. Who knows?
Good. Yeah. Okay.
Things will come around. You mentioned some. Your writing is quite descriptive. There's some passages that are squeamish in the
Sure. Yeah,
Queen. Yeah.
absolutely.
My goodness. Yes, especially the ants.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
I I gotta say, I get a real kick out of those type of scenes. And as to where they come from, I mean, you mentioned Barker. Barker was quite descriptive for his day. Like James Herbert with the rats,
Okay.
was very descriptive. And even with the ants, I said in my afterword, there's this awesome story written by Carl Stevenson years ago. It used to be taught in schools, called Lenigan versus the Ants, which was about a plantation that was under threat of these ants, and sort of the steps that were taken to try and combat them. Some successfully, some much less successfully. So yeah, ant fiction hilariously. I shouldn't say hilariously, but there's a great tradition of insect fiction, I guess, but also just specifically ants. Who would have known?
And would you recommend this? Or I haven't heard of this writer.
Oh, if you've not read Lenigan versus the Ants, yeah, I would, you can find it like online, like there's a,
Okay.
a PDF of it. It was published in Esquire probably back in the 40s. And I think I was still too young. They weren't teaching it in school by the time I came of age, but it definitely in the 60s and the 70s, it would have been taught maybe into the 80s, taught in American high schools. And I can see why. I can see why as a piece of writing, it's really interesting. It maybe doesn't hold up sort of, it would be considered culturally insensitive in certain ways at this point, but as just a rip-roaring kind of adventure story, it's pretty hard to beat.
Okay, I'll check it out. Oh, speaking of the ants in your story, I mean, there are a lot of fascinating anecdotes in The Queen. And I want to know if they are at all based on any fact, especially the ants and especially the pheromones, the QMP.
QMP, well, yeah, the ants were,
Please tell me now.
to sort of expand on some of the research I did. Yes, there are ants like that, first of all. Whether they've ever eaten anybody, not to give a spoiler, I guess I just did, but they definitely do go on these kind of crusades. They just in massive packs. They just go. They'll tear through a jungle, like a scythe basically. And it's like a seasonal thing, and it doesn't happen every season. But there was a great story by H.G. Wells. I think it was called Kingdom of the Ants, that again sort of dealt with this particular breed of ant in a different way. And then in the 70s, there was again, I think James Herbert kicked off this wave of animals gone wild. There were crabs that were eating everybody. There were dogs that were Cujo. So, and there were a couple books in the 70s about marauding ants. I didn't read those ones, but I know they exist. And then there was, as I said in my afterword, there was an episode of the TV show MacGyver, which was clearly based on um, Lenigan versus the ants. It was MacGyver and some other people trying to stave off these ants from taking over a research facility in the jungle. So yeah, that was the research that I did on that, abetted to the idea that, that breed of ant actually exists. And then yeah, QMP, yeah, that is pheromones in the insect world are super popular. I mean, we obviously exude pheromones. Humans do at a different level,
Right.
and lots of animals do, but insects use them a ton, and insect queens especially use them. I mean, in a way that obviously is unintelligible, not unintelligible, but like completely outside of the bounds of if we were able to do that to another human being, it would be considered a war crime, obviously, So it's sort of like hypnotism, but to the point where you actually would control another person, um, sort of from a great distance. So yeah, when I discovered that, I thought, oh, um, you could have fun with that. You could certainly, put some little grenades in the narrative. And when the time came along, you could detonate them, and people would sort of ideally, um, it'd be a well, I'm trying, what's the word I'm looking for? A twist, essentially, so yeah, I have a great time with that. Like, I really enjoy the research portion of it. Sometimes I wade into waters that are much deeper than my own intellectual level allows, so I have to, like, okay, that's now we're beyond what I really need. But yeah, I really enjoy doing the research aspect of it, and bringing that into the book if I can manage it.
And if you don't mind, I do also want to talk about your other work
Sure.
that you put under different names. You had
Yes.
you had success. You started off writing under your own name, Craig Davidson, right?
Correct. Mhm.
But then uh, you started using Patrick.
Patrick
Uh,
Lestuca.
yeah,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
yeah.
Yes. Actually, I started initially writing under Patrick.
Okay.
My first, yeah, it's a long and odd writing career, but yeah, and as as troublesome as, say, the Nick Cutter books are, or what am I trying to say? If they tread the line, and they're threshold crossing. The Patrick stuff is that was me in my early 20s and mid 20s, and trying to be the most revolting human being on earth, I think.
Okay.
And there's, you know, it's, if you're going to do it, I guess that's the time in your life to do it. I mean, well, there's no time not to do it. If you want to write that way. I know some writers, that's their stock and trade throughout their entire career, and honestly, good on them. But yeah, to me, I wrote some, well, they were published by a company called Necro, which is sadly no
Right.
longer around, but they were known as the home of hardcore horror. That's what they marketed themselves as, and run by just like one of the most lovely people you'll ever meet. Sadly passed on, but I wanted to be part of that roster. So I wrote these books, and got them accepted with him, and but I felt like, oh, they're so rough that even at that age, I thought, you know what, it's probably best to go under a pen name. So I did. And then I actually went to university and did a master's program. And that's where I wrote my thesis project, which was some short stories, which ended up being turned into Rust and Bone, my first book. And so I followed that path for about 10 years. And then I had this idea that would not leave me, and it was a horror book. So then Nick Cutter came out of that. So it was Patrick, me, and Nick.
Okay. Now I wanted to know why you went to horror because Rust and Bone, your first book, that was a huge hit in France at least when it came out. That's where I was living.
I think because of the movie, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think it did okay, but it was really Jacques Audiard who was most memorable, that, and Marion Cotillard and Matthias Schoenaerts, and that sort of is what did that. But yeah, outside of that, I could have kept doing it, but I grew up as a horror reader, like in the 80s and 90s, as you said, like Barker, King, obviously, Kuntz, Robert R. McCammon, Anne Rice. Like I read so much horror. And so I just had this idea that wouldn't leave me alone. And I knew it was horror. And I remember when I sent it to my agent, I wrote it like in a white heat, sort of it, I think maybe over 6 weeks or something. So he didn't even know I was doing it.
And this was the troop.
And this is the troop, yes. And so I
Okay.
sent it to him, and I sort of expect him to call me up and say, "We are no longer on speaking terms.
Right.
This is way outside of what I was going to represent you for." But to my gratefulness, he was like, "No, I think this is really interesting," and he sent it out, and we, had got some traction with it, and then I had this really other cool opportunity for the last 10 years of my life to write these books under Nick Cutter.
And why is horror important? And I'm asking this very specifically
Sure.
because my mother is constantly saying to me, Michael, why don't you write something nice? Why do you have to write this ugly stuff? And I don't have
my,
a good answer for her.
no, I don't either. You realize, probably you as a writer, me as a writer, we realize that in some ways I'm shocked I've had a career for as long as I have, because the books are pretty bleak and they're pretty rough, and even some horror books will, drag a reader through the mud, but then, pick them up over the last 50 pages and set them gently on shore and dust them off and, send them on their way. And I think a lot of readers appreciate that. Um, I think my tactic is to drag them through the mud and then step on their head.
Yeah.
Um,
And they enjoy that as well. Readers
yeah.
enjoy that.
Well, I don't know if they'd enjoy it at all, actually. Maybe over time they're like, that's enough of that. But I think I've just, like if I'm talking about Stephen King, I think my favorite book of his is It, probably. But the one that I think is most resonant to me outside of Carrie, which is, as I said, a huge influence, but it's probably Pet Cemetery,
Went over my
because
head.
it's the meanest, meanest, maybe that's not the right way of saying it, but it's the most unremitting, and it's the one that he's not going to let you off the hook, and it's the one that there are chances for a happy ending, and then there's a chance for at least a qualified happy ending, and then that's gone, and then there's just different shades of bad, and he sort of holds that and he sticks the landing on that. Um, but I think probably if he had written all of his books like that, I think it probably over time would have, people would have been a little bit upset with that. But I'd said, like, the same question that your mom asked you, or that I'm sure my mom has asked me, it's not that I'm a bleak human being. I'm sure the same goes for you. Yes, I can certainly have periods where, I can be bleak, but I think in general I'm not. So where the aesthetic comes from and why I decide to write the way I write, it's a very hard thing to say, right? Like, I don't know what you tell your mom. I don't know what I tell my parents either, or
Yeah.
anyone who asks that question.
I
Like,
don't have a kid.
yeah, why do the birds fly? Why does the sun shine? It happens as it happens. And if I change it, or if you changed it, I think it wouldn't be as truthful.
Right, definitely, yeah.
Um, and um, and I think readers could tell that too, So that's my feeling on it. But also, like, life is long. I'm not saying that there's not a chance that I will write one of those books that has maybe not a Cutter book, but a book that has a happy ending. It's not that I don't believe that those things don't happen in real life. Maybe I don't think that they happen as often as, people who write those types of books would like readers to believe. Sometimes I feel it's just pandering to a reader, and maybe I'm resistant to do that.
But speaking of happy endings, I want to talk very briefly about Little Heaven, which is
Sure.
one I loved. I have a crush on Minerva, and I would like to know. I mean, she's more woman than I can handle. I understand that.
Oh, me too.
But do you think that there is a way that she would ever be with a guy like me? Do you think we could make it work?
Well, I see no reason why not. You know what I mean?
Thank
Like,
you.
I don't know where she is right now. I'm trying to think. I think she ends. Well, they have a qualified happy ending. She survives anyways. That for a Cutter book is, you got to
Yes.
consider yourself lucky. So, maybe she does. She wants to, go to Latvia, settle down,
Jeez.
or you guys can both, move to Canada.
Oh yeah, that's
I think she, if you didn't, if it didn't become like a full-time thing, it could definitely be a fun, couple months until she burns you right out and
yeah.
just leaves you happy. Just
I
like,
I couldn't handle her full time, so I'm
right,
happy
exactly.
happy
Yeah.
put.
You're just like, yeah, just enjoy it for as long as it lasts. And then when the breeze blows her off off to a different zone, then you okay, go with God.
And I have a question. Oh, about the deep.
Sure.
Were you trying to suffocate me when you wrote that? Am I ever going to be able to swim again? My goodness, that is just a suffocating read.
Yeah,
My
well, and
oh,
bleak as well, right? Yeah, I was writing that when my son was just born and I was sleepless. Me and my wife both were. And I was juggling deadlines and just in a weird headspace, obviously. I think that probably of all the books I've ever written, it was written in a compressed period of time. I kind of knew what I was doing, but I was kind of not exactly as aware. Like the plot was just sort of blopping from one thing to the next. I think it's a really interesting series of creepy, suffocating, claustrophobic scenes. It might not necessarily have the narrative cohesion that I had wanted, but it's definitely, and you've written books like this maybe too. It's like some of them just come out of a certain time and place in your life and can be traced back to the emotions and the sort of overriding feeling that you had at that time in your life. And that's probably of all the books I've ever written, is a time and place book that is a reflection of sleeplessness,
oh, interesting,
worry, um, and just a general sense of life change.
interesting. I have a question from a viewer,
Sure.
gentle reader. Her
Okay.
question is, "Dear God, why?"
That of everything you mean? Just why?
That's just what she told me to ask you. I don't know.
Well, I can say that that's not the first time I've been posed that question. Um, why not? Uh,
That's a fair question. That's a fair response.
all right.
And before we get cut off, I want to thank you for taking the time and thank you
Oh,
for
my
your
pleasure,
work
Michael.
as well. And on behalf of all the viewers, we are wishing the Queen a lot of success and you a lot of success. And I also want to encourage the viewers, who mostly horror viewers, but I want to encourage them to check out Cataract City. I think that's
Please
still,
do.
yeah,
There's a special place in my heart for that book.
me
It's
too.
probably one of the most honest books I've ever written. So I'm glad you enjoy it too.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a deep cut, but I like it very much, and I'm pleased that you do too.
Yeah, so thank you very much. In closing, I would just like to say, go on, you crazy bastard. Send me a postcard from China.
Thanks so much, Michael. I hope you find some roots in Latvia, and if not, we'll see you in Canada at some point.
Big thanks to Craig Davidson for sharing his time. I want to encourage all of you horror fans out there to check out his new book, The Queen. It is a wild ride. Part page turning mystery, part creepy horror. Also, if you read literary fiction, definitely check out Cataract City. Two friends growing up in Canada, life pulls them in separate directions, but there's a strong bond that keeps them, for better or worse, tethered. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend. Also, help other horror fans find this channel. Give this video a like, subscribe if you haven't already. Next week, I will be talking with another Simon and Schuster horror writer, Tanya Pell. We'll be discussing, among other things, her latest book, Cicada, available from Shortwave Books. I hope to see you there, and I hope to connect with you in the comment section below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.